So this is the opposite of what Roddy did. He was doing professional music from an amateur psychiatrist's perspective, if I may treat it with some levity. Rupert's a professional psychiatrist. He's also a brilliant harpist. He's played for us loads of times, and we're very, very grateful for that. But he's going to bring his experiences together in this talk, which we're going to find very interesting. We're going to have some musical examples as well.
Thank you very much. It's a rather peculiar sort of opportunity to be given, just to talk about myself and my sort of journey in music, really. But what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about that. So about just what my experiences have been with amateur music, and also just illustrate it with some pieces that have been important to me. You've referred to, Richard's referred to what Roddy had to say. And actually one of the things that I thought was most interesting about what he said was that he said, you know, if you don't enjoy it, what's the point in doing it? And I have to say, I wish I found it such an unadulterated pleasure, because it hasn't always been for me. And so what I get to talk a little bit about is some of the pain of music as well, of performing. And the pain of failure that can happen, and actually what the benefits of that experience has been, as well as the highs, of course. So I went to a prep school that was very musical, and one of my earliest memories of performing was about a month after I'd started playing the piano. Every week for that month, I had maybe it was longer than that, I'd had a piece ticked off by my piano teacher as completed. And after 2 months, there came the lesson where I didn't have a piece ticked off. And aged 7, I was mortified by this. And I remember going up to my dormitory and lying on the bed and absolutely in floods of tears about this. And how one of my colleagues, he came and comforted me about this. So that was my first experience of failure. But one of the other things that happened at this prep school was that there was a 5-minute break between each lesson. And outside the classroom, there was a very small practice room with a piano in it. And I spent, one of the first pieces that really grabbed me at that time was a piece by Scott Joplin called The Entertainer. It was all the rage in the, I suppose this was 1970s, early 70s. And I spent hours and hours trying to play this piece, which was actually quite difficult. And then I arranged it for some colleagues of mine, you know, for a small instrumental ensemble. I just sort of liked the intellectual challenge, really, of doing some transposition for the transposing instruments and so forth. And we played that once or twice. You know, like all the girls in the choir, you know, I played instruments, had lessons, and of course, one of the things that happens with music lessons is that you get individual attention, and that's a fantastic experience, I think. And what I found was that as I got reasonably good, so I was about grade 5 at the age of 13, something like that, in the piano, and the clarinet was the other instrument that I played. And when I went on to my next school, one of the drivers for me and music was that this was something that I could do. It was simply about self-esteem. And I found that I could do this, and other people had other skills, but this was what I could do. And it sort of marked me out, if you like. I was a musician. And that was very positive, and it helped me to drive me to continue to do things. But it did have a downside, and that was that I felt after a bit that I was really just being a monkey. I was learning this technical skill, and I remember being rather contemptuous of myself about it. But actually, of course, that gaining that facility with the instruments was really crucial in then being able to enjoy the music with it. So that's been very important. I had a clarinet teacher, and this clarinet teacher, he would come to the school. He was a peripatetic clarinet teacher, and he would spend the day in this very small practice room and teaching a succession of pupils. And I think he was a rather bitter man, actually, and he was, I think, struggling to get work as a professional performer. And he was very, very helpful to me, very positive. But one of the things that he did say that that's always been with me, he said, if you can be anything else other than a professional musician, do it, because professional music is such a hard life. And so, listening to Roddy and the joy that he gets from it is just staggering. And one of the things that I was very lucky indeed to learn at school was that there were several boys at the schools that I were at who were massively talented. And I wasn't massively talented at all. And that comparison helped me to sort of see that, in fact, in the future, it was probably not such a good idea to put my eggs in that particular basket of professional music. So one of the things that I did want to do was to play in orchestras. I loved that experience right from the start. And obviously, to start with, I played clarinet in orchestras, not piano. I had several auditions for the local youth orchestra, which was in Essex, which was a very fine youth orchestra. They had, like Oxfordshire do now, they had 2 youth orchestras. Or Oxfordshire has 3, don't they? I think. But anyway, it had two youth orchestras. And I couldn't get in on the clarinet. It was very difficult. There were lots of people who were very, very good clarinetists. And that was part of the driver for thinking about whether I should play a different instrument that was easier to get into orchestras. And my father and I sort of thought about this, and the school wanted viola players. Now, the viola is a very fine instrument indeed, but it doesn't have quite the pizzazz of the harp. And really, we wrestled with which of these 2 instruments I should learn. And the advantage of the harp, of course, is that it's a standalone instrument. You can play it like a piano. It's a solo instrument. But of course, there isn't much music for the harp, not much orchestral repertoire, whole swathes of music that one doesn't get to play, at least not at an amateur level. There aren't lots of harp parts for Bach or Handel or this sort of thing. So anyway, I decided to play the harp, and in some ways I sort of regret that now. But in others, it's been absolutely the right decision. And I'll come back to a bit about why in a moment. But what it did mean is that I got into the orchestras fairly quickly, and I've played with lots of orchestras that are much better than me. So that's been a wonderful experience. And I'm going to I started the harp when I was 15, and got into youth orchestra within a year. And I'm going to play you one of the first, well, probably the first piece that really captured my imagination, which is a Passacaglia by Handel. One of the things about playing the harp is that pretty much a lot of the music one plays is arrangements from other music, from other instruments. So I'll play this. It's about 3 or 4 minutes long. that's Pascal by Handel. And as I was playing it, I was reminded of something very wise that I thought Roddy said, which was that when he was talking about performing and how when he's thinking about all the myriad of things that are going on, and sometimes he's really able to get into the zone and just able to forget about the audience and just be completely absorbed in the music. And this is one of the main battles that I have when I'm playing, is that I have this little person that's talking to me all the time. And when they talk too loudly, my fingers go like this. And so trying to get into that zone and keeping in that zone is really crucial, and just to switch that other part of the brain off. So I started the harp. I played in the Essex Youth Orchestra. We were very lucky in Essex that the teachers, the coaches were from the LSO. We had Dennis Wicks, and my teacher was from the LSO as well. I went on to audition for the National Youth Orchestra and got into that, but had a sort of love-hate relationship with it. I thought they were rather infantilizing at that time. And I also had a desperate experience with Ravel's Rhapsody Espagnole. We were doing this piece for the proms, I think it was, and there were 3 harpists, and the other 2 were very, very accomplished. There's a particular passage in Ravel's Rhapsody Espagnole that I kept getting wrong. And so I didn't get to play in that concert, but it was a good thing. It was a good thing to have been involved in. Well, I had much happier time at university playing in very many. Of course, you play the harp. Everybody wants you to play the harp. It's fantastic. You're in demand all the time. It's a bit less so now. The harp is a much more popular instrument than it was when I was at university. And one of the things that I did that taught me an enormous amount was I started busking. And I busked outside Auntie's tea room in Cambridge. And what I found was a very tight relationship between how I played and how much money I got. And it was really not to do with whether I played the right notes or not. It was really about the passion that I put into it and the projection. And I tend to play even rather unemotional pieces in a rather emotional sort of way. I like cheese in my music, basically. That taught me a lot. And of course, a lot of people would walk past and book me to do things, and so that was great as well. And another setting where I played occasionally after I'd started doing medicine was on the wards. And I remember a Sunday afternoon on the neurology ward in Norwich, where I took the harp on the ward and played a bit, and just the immense change in atmosphere, the sudden stillness that there was, and the quiet and people's concentrated listening. And it was wonderful moment. Now, what I thought I'd do is I'd say a little bit about the harp as an instrument, just for those that don't know how it works. So let's just, that's good. All right. So I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, you can see it.
Tell me if you can see this, but essentially what there is, you can see that there are red strings here and black strings. The red strings are C's, the black strings are F's, and the natural key of the harp is C flat major. So 7 flats, and you may not be able to see it, but essentially each string has 2 discs. And when I press the C pedal, there are 7 pedals, 1 for each note in the octave. It twists this little disc, which has 2 prongs, so that when I press it, it goes from being a C flat to a C natural. And that affects every C in the instrument. And then I press it down another notch, and that's C sharp. And what that means is that you can play a C sharp and a D flat on different strings. So of course they sound the same, C sharp and D flat. And that's how we get the possibility of glissandi. So if one sets the pedals in a certain way, you can effectively miss out some notes in the scale and create a chord. So that's obviously one of the strengths of this particular type of instrument. You may see that I'm on my fingers, I'm wearing some little plasters, and that's because I haven't done enough practice. So if you do lots and lots of practice, you get very hard callus on your finger, and then it goes a slightly softer if you continue playing on it. But I'm afraid, as things are at the moment, I require a little bit of protection with this excellent tape. So one of the things that is very easiest to play is the glissandi. One of the things that's actually hardest to play on the harp is scales. And it's very hard to sight read on. I know everybody pleads this sort of thing, but sight reading on the harp is actually very difficult. And one of the reasons why the scales, to go back to the scales, is difficult is that you only use 4 fingers. So we don't use the little finger when they're playing the harp. What I'm going to do is use some excerpts from the Britten Ceremony of Carols, which is another very important piece to me, to just show you some of how that works. So I'm just going to share my screen now, if I may. Thanks, Richard, if you could just allow me to share the screen. Okay. Hang on, let's just go back. Sorry, I've got the wrong talk on there. Okay, so this is the first example. Can you see my screen there?
No, we can't.
No, sorry.
Okay, hang on. Let's just go back. Can you see that now?
Yep.
Okay, so this is the opening of that younger child from the Ceremony of Carols, and it's a sort of like a sigh, and you can see here how the harp part here is a D flat, C sharp, and B sharp, or in fact it's played as. The other thing that you can see is this little diagram here on the left-hand side, and that's just shorthand for how we set the pedals. So the D here on the far left is a D flat in the top notch, then you've got a C sharp and a B sharp, and then on the other side of the instrument, on the right-hand side of the instrument, I've got an E flat, an F natural, a G natural, and an A flat in the top note. So this just sounds like this. And it has that sort of sighing quality to it. And Britten actually wrote this piece. He'd been exploring the harp. He was great friends with a man called Ossian Ellis, and he often wrote pieces for his friends. And he was exploring the harp, getting to learn about it, because he wanted to write a harp concerto. But he found this set of English poems in a bookshop in Nova Scotia in Canada. And he wrote this Ceremony of Carols on the way back based on these poems. And of course, there's a sort of sighing quality to that. The next example is that you'll those of you that sing will be all too aware of. This is probably the most difficult of the numbers in Ceremony of Carols, and it doesn't sit naturally with the harp. Britten's trying to do something that's very odd, which is having trills. Trills don't really work on the harp properly because they tend to buzz as you put your finger back. So it introduces, that buzzing actually introduces a slightly sharp quality, and it contributes to that sort of icy texture that I think is a wonderful piece of word painting to have. So it's with some extraneous notes in there as well. And then here's another piece of word painting, and this you may think that this is stretching it a bit, but I like to think Britain sitting down thinking, how am I going to set this carol about wheat and so forth? Let's just see, I don't know if you can see the ear of wheat. So I think I like to think of the glissando as the stalk, and then at the top there's this sort of little cluster. So it's so the ears of wheat, if you like, and then you've got the glissando as the stalk. This is probably stretching it a bit, but stretching it even further. But I told you I liked sort of emotional stories in my music. The interlude for the Ceremony of Carols is a wonderful piece of music. Britain is experimenting and using the harmonics of the harp, so touch the string halfway, and instead of having it, so it's an octave up. And I like to think of the shape of this particular melody, that he used the shape of the cross and also the Star of Bethlehem in deciding how he was going to write the thing. And it's and so that's one thing. So here's the cross with the long interval there as being the down bit, if you like, and then the Star of David, perhaps Star of Bethlehem on the top. And you can see that it's written in C flat major, the open key of the harp, so that it sounds the strings ring better than if they're pinched by the pins. And this piece I like to think of as being the story of Christ's life. So it starts with this incredibly naive passage and very pure, and then it becomes gradually more majestic. So a little further on, there's basically the same pattern. Yeah. Okay, and then I'll tell you a little story about this piece. I was doing a concert with the prep school boys choir, and it was to be in King's College Chapel in Cambridge, big concert, playing this piece. And I drove, the rehearsals for it were somewhere in Lincolnshire. And it was very cold, and I was driving over a hill back from the rehearsals towards Cambridge, and I came across a man who was lying in the road, who'd fallen off his bicycle. There was nobody around, so I stopped the car and got out, and he was dying. He'd had a heart attack some time earlier, I later found out, and he died while I was trying to resuscitate him. And so then I had to drive on to the rehearsal, to the concert in King's Chapel. So faced with this, this scene on the hill, and then this wonderful setting. And there's a part of this particular piece that whenever I play it, this image comes to mind. And so it's a very sort of emotional thing, and it reminds me of the crucifixion as well. So let's go on. The next piece that I wanted to just tell you about, I think we can close that down now, stop screen sharing, is a piece by Maurice Ravel. And Maurice Ravel was a rather dapper sort of character, and he was involved in a sort of tussle in Paris at the turn of the century between two rival harp makers. There was the harp maker Erard, who had designed the type of harp that we now use with these discs and the prongs, and a rival company called Pleyel. They were both piano making companies originally, and they had turned their hand to making harp, and Pleyel's harp had crossed strings like this, and it was fiendishly difficult to play. And Pleyel commissioned Debussy to write a piece, and that's the Debussy Dances Sacred and Profane. And Erard commissioned Ravel to write this Introduction and Allegro, which is for harp, string quartet, flute and clarinet. And this was one of the pieces that kept me going in terms of just the sheer joy of and miraculousness of the writing. And I just want to play you, he was experimenting with the possibilities of the harp, bringing the harmonics, the glissandi, the arpeggiated figures all together. And I'll just play you a little bit of I'll just play you a couple of minutes of the cadenza going into the passage directly afterwards. So you can imagine there's been this big dramatic lead up to the cadenza, which goes. At this point, we have all the rest of the instruments, and I have an advantage over you in that I can hear it all, whereas you can't. So, but that's a wonderful piece that I had a lot of fun with over the years. And just before I finish up with a piece of Bach, I just want to tell you about probably the most important thing that's happened to me in my amateur music making, and that's I was introduced to a place called Piggott's. And Piggott's is an extraordinary institution on the top of a hill near High Wycombe. It's a farmhouse where people come and play music at weekends, or they have 10-day music camps as well. You bring your tent and pitch a tent, and everybody chips in with helping with the food. And I was asked to play by somebody I'd been at university with there. And we came along and played Mahler 4, and it was absolutely freezing. And I found myself thinking, in that sort of slightly contrary way, anything that can get people here under this circumstance, must have something about it. And for sure, I've had enormous fun there playing operas and all the big 20th century, 19th century repertoire. It's been a wonderful vehicle, and probably the most important part of all my amateur music making that has the thing that's been most important to me is just the friendship. So I've grown up with people there over the last 40 years, I suppose, and got to know them, and they've had children, and their children's children are coming back, and it has lots of multi-generational families that go there. So it's a wonderful institution, all centered around making music. And if anybody wants to find out more about it, I'd be delighted to tell you, because I think it's a wonderful thing to get involved in. I'm going to finish with a piece by Bach. It's very short. It's his first prelude. And the reason that I like this piece is its simplicity. And again, I think it sort of reminds me of a journey going somewhere. It starts at bass, goes somewhere and comes back again. And within this piece, there are lots of mini diversions. But it also speaks to something that we were talking with Roddy about, which is suspensions in music, and the sort of joy that comes of suspensions, the sort of the tension and resolution that exists in music, and that I think is so important in helping people. It's part of the joy of music. And if we want to talk more about why afterwards, I'm happy to talk more about it. So this is just the Bach first prelude. And it obviously works well because it's an arpeggiated figure. And of course, the term arpeggio comes from the term arpa. So, and that's because arpeggios naturally sit under the fingers for the harp. Happy to take any questions if anybody wants to ask me about the harp, or want to talk about their experience of amateur music as well.
Rupert, should I kick off? I was intrigued by the fact that you described your teacher as being slightly bitter. You might have been using that in a sort of psychiatrist sense, and then you went on to paint a very nice picture of him.
Yes, I mean, I think bitter is the wrong term. I think he was disappointed. He was disappointed that he wasn't able to perform more, that life was difficult. You know, he spent a long time teaching. I'm not sure that teaching was what he really wanted to do. But you know, I was tremendously grateful to him, and he did, you know, wonderful, you know, we did some wonderful things, you know, and it was interesting. He epitomized something else I noticed, and this happened in the harp world too, is he was part of a particular school of clarinet playing, if I can put it like that. He had aligned himself with the early music world of Alan Hacker, who played at York, and he wanted me to play with a particular sort of sound. And it was a rather narrow, reedy sound. And actually it wasn't a sound that I found terribly attractive. And he was always a bit contemptuous of the sound that the clarinets of the Berlin Phil made, which I actually rather liked. and different clarinets made those sorts of sound, those Boozy and Hawkes 10-10 sounds, very different sound from the sound that a French clarinet will make. And so there was that sort of sense of a battle going on between the two different factions. And the same thing happened with the harp. So my harp teacher, my second harp teacher, Renata Scheffelstein, who played with the LSO, she was the only woman in the LSO for many, many years. And she was very Germanic indeed, very disciplined, and always talked about, you know, the importance of being prepared. Very, very important lesson. And she played in a very different style from Marisa Robles. So Renata was the professor at the academy, and Marisa was the professor at the Royal College. And Renata told this wonderful story of how Marisa Robles was very well known soloist. She used to do a lot of work with James Galway, who was a flautist who was very famous at that time. Marisa was going on tour for some time, and so she needed somebody to teach her pupils. And so she asked Renata if she would take over her pupils, and because she couldn't find anybody else to do it. They didn't really like each other, and Renata said, you know, it's not going to work. You know, your pupils play in a different way to me. And anyway, you know, Renata was not going to be forgiving about this, and you know, she did teach her Marisa's pupils, and within about a fortnight, Marisa was on the phone shouting at her in her very Latin way about how she was trying to change all her pupils' technique and so forth. So I thought that was an interesting sort of insight into what happens in professional music sometimes.
Well, we certainly find it with singing teachers, I can tell you.
Yeah, people get very passionate about the right way of doing things, don't they?
I think one of the things it takes many decades to enjoy different approaches to things.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think it's so important, and it's one of the reasons why when I started the Girls' Choir nearly 40 years ago, I got involved with different genres of music and different styles of performance, and I brought in people to work with us in these different areas. And this has borne fruit in the sense that a lot of our old members have gone on to do different things, contrasting in different styles, and I rather like it. I would be extremely bored to live in a world where everything was done the same.
Absolutely.
I can't understand why so many people think that that's the way one should do things.
Yeah, and I think that what you say reminds me of another point, which is about how some things take a very long time before they become possible. And I think I sort of alluded to this at the beginning, and I have found that music is a very hard taskmaster, and because it's very exacting. You play wrong notes and they're wrong. And it goes on and on. And until you get very, very good, you play lots of wrong notes. And I found that extremely difficult. And of course, when you're playing the harp in an orchestra, you spend a lot of time counting. If you get it wrong and you come in the wrong place, at least you're not a trombone. So at least, it's not always obvious. But, it's, if you're counting 234 bars instead of 233, then you've missed your entry. And things happen in that tiny gap just before you're about to play, and time gets distorted in a very peculiar way as you become more anxious about getting your entry right. And so it's taken a long time for me to be able to relax and to not beat myself up too much about mistakes. I think if that's one message that I'd like to get over to the girls is, don't beat yourself up too much about it. Most people don't notice, and even if they do, they're very forgiving. And try to be more forgiving of yourself for making errors. And it's part of that development of resilience that comes through the practice of music. And interestingly, in my first surgical house job, when I met this surgeon, he was an orthopedic surgeon in King's Lynn on the first day, very big sort of archetypal orthopedic surgeon that everybody was scared of. And he said, "Oh, what are your interests?" And I thought, "Oh God, I'm not interested in rugby. How am I?" And I said, "I play the harp." And he said, "Oh, so you're a musician, are you? Oh, well, that's great. I like working with musicians. They're always they've got good attention to detail and they work hard." So. I thought that was a nice comment, and a bit surprising.
Dad, perhaps there's a question in the chat, if you can see that, or do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, read it out.
She says, "I've always disliked the rather snobbish divide that sometimes happens, completely unnecessarily, in my view, between amateur and professional in music. Have you encountered that much?"
Well, I mean, professionals, yeah, I don't see a lot of that. I mean, at Piggott's, for example, there are a lot of professional musicians who are music teachers and people who play for a living who will come and play alongside people who don't. So that's absolutely an area where that doesn't happen. And, we'll do operas and the principals from ENO will come along and practice out a new role. And many of the people that have come and played in those sorts of amateur settings, they go on to be professionals. And so, part of the art of organising a weekend is to spot somebody who's on the way up in their profession and going to be a professional soon. And when they're professional, of course, they won't be they'll be too busy to come back often. Although people like Martin Brabbins and Grant Llewellyn and lots of other people, do come back to Piggott's and conduct there. And we've had just the most wonderful constellation of people who have performed at Piggott's, and so the professional amateur thing. I mean, I have enormous respect for professionals. The hard work, the hard graft that goes into it, I think is amazing. I think they're wildly underpaid. I could never understand how musicians, in society's eyes, don't seem to have the status of, for example, doctors. The amount of work that musicians put in is often far more than doctors. And it's a tough life. So for many. So I have enormous respect for the professionals, and I wanted to say something else. I always found oral tests very difficult, and actually I think there's something genetic about this. I think some people are born to be able to do oral tests and to have that sort of sense of pitch. There's something about their memory that seems to be better, I think. Obviously people with perfect pitch have a very good memory for particular pitch, but that sort of innate talent, I think, is very important. A bit like with athletes, there are some people who are never going to be able to run a 10-second 100 meters. They're the wrong shape. And so I have enormous respect for that. And I think it's quite important for people to recognize their abilities, their limitations, but also not to be put off, to understand that lots of problems can be overcome with with work. And I think one of the main talents that musicians need to have is the talent for hard work. So the talent for doing things again and again and being prepared to stick with it. And that's a sort of talent in a way, I think. Some people just don't seem to be built to do that. So I think that also demands enormous respect. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer.
I think your word respect is the key one there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Respecting other people always in whatever you do, I think, is the thing.
Yeah, and recognizing that somebody isn't a professional or whatever. Yeah.
Well, also defining the terms. I mean, Peps and I have a shared experience of the amateur versus professional quandary when it comes to the Vivaldi's Women project. We've discovered low women's voices, you know. And so how do we manage that? We put on these gigs at the BBC and all the rest of it, where we've got people singing soprano, alto, tenor and bass, and they're all women, okay? So even when you get down as far as the altos, it's hard to find a good woman singer. So we have to work with the amateurs. And then you say, well, what is an amateur? It's meaningless.
We want to work with them.
Yeah, it's meaningless. We want to work with them. Yes.
My suggestion is that I'll tell you a story about that. When I was between school and university, I went to Australia, and I was staying with some rather elderly relatives, and wanted to talk to people of my own age. And so I went along to the New South Wales Conservatorium of Music, and I said, "Who's your harpist?" And they introduced me to somebody called Lynn Williams, who now actually runs the National Choir of Australia, the Gondwana. If you ever want to hear a really fine children's choir, that's an amazing outfit to listen to. But she said, "Oh, I'm glad we've met you. We need somebody for our concert at the end of the term." So I ended up getting to play in the Sydney Opera House. And we did the Berlioz's Damnation of Faust, and the entire tenor section is female. So maybe the answer is to get Australians for your tenor section.
I could probably persuade English people to think like Australians. Plenty of people can do it. You know.
But exactly. Yes. So broad mind.
From your professional experience, I mean, have you got anything to say about either music or psychiatry from your experience of perhaps teaching the occasional, treating the occasional musician, without telling us anything about individual?
Not really, actually. I mean, I think, as I say, I think musicians are very hard on themselves. So I think that that self-compassion and mindfulness now much more how one in psychiatry and how professional musicians, how musicians, I think, at college are taught to manage some of these issues. That issue about being in the zone and it's almost like a trance state. I think, again, fostering that as a technique for self-preservation and for helping oneself out of being too self-critical. I think these are all very good techniques that I think actually I've learned as much from music bringing them into psychiatry as the other way around. I lived with music therapists for a while. When I first was training in London. And we used to have lots of arguments about the benefits of music therapy. This isn't strictly on topic, but it just reminds me of it. At that point, I was 20, I suppose, and I was always arguing, well, why should the NHS spend money on music therapy where the benefit is rather time limited compared, for example, to kidney transplants or whatever. I think that was a very naive view. And in fact, if I have a few ambitions, well, I have some ambitions left. And one of them is to support a project that's run by, or that was started by some people called Live Music Now, which is an organization founded by Yehudi Menuhin. Their aspiration is to have a choir in every care home. And I would love to see music, particularly amateur music, actually, amateur musicians spending a lot of time in care homes, because there are such acres of time where there's nothing going on. And to have kids coming in and playing their party piece or practicing their grade 5 piece in front of people, just getting that experience of performing in a different setting. And what I would like to see actually is particular care homes having a choir in residence, or an organisation in residence, because I think that building that relationship between the care home and the choir, or people playing their instruments or whatever. I think that has a great benefit for the performers. But the other thing that it does is that it brings sunlight, if you like, into the care homes. It helps people to see what happens in care homes, and it helps people to see just how grim it can be for some people, and also, but how joyful as well. So I think that earlier exposure to what happens to elderly people, I think is actually something that is going to help us as a society. And I actually see music and choral singing or instrumental playing in care homes as a vehicle to that.
I mean, we organised a music therapy weekend in 1999, which I called The Power of Music, which is a term that's been used lots by people. But this was in the early days. And I did it with my friends Raymond and Mary Abbottson from the North Yorkshire Music Therapy Service. They're pioneers, and they bought a big van, I think it's a big Ford Transit, and had it carpeted, walls and ceiling, and did a lot of work with children with Downs and spina bifida and all sorts of things. And they drove around North Yorkshire doing music therapy classes and teaching. Mm-hmm. And we also worked with Abby Strevens and all the Oxford music therapists. And it was quite an easy thing to organise. I just set it up and wound it up, and off it went. And it was a very successful weekend. It's something I'd love to do again with the choir. And we did a concert as part of it. I did it because in the 90s we had lots of girls who were of an extraordinary standard. Some of them were temperamentally very shy and just couldn't bring themselves. They wanted to do music. They didn't want to be performers. They didn't have the pizzazz to get on the stage. And I was looking for activities, what I call paramusic activities, which is the sort of thing I do really in many areas, for them to do. And I thought this was the ideal solution. We'd have a conference on music therapy. We held it at Mansfield College. And I had therapists from all over the country. And it was highly successful.
Yeah. Well, it can be enormously powerful therapeutic, as you say. Yeah.
Gigi, is Gigi here? Gigi, you're a harpist. We've got some harp questions.
I guess, how do you deal with breaking the strings?
In the middle of a concert?
Yeah, and just play.
Well, obviously, if you're playing in an orchestral piece, you just have to get fast with repairing it, with changing it. I've only ever had one wire string go in a concert, and that was in a solo recital at a girls' school, and there was this enormous bang, and suddenly they all woke up. And again, I was just able to make a feature of demonstrating how to put a string on. But obviously, it's.
Are the tricks you can do using the pedals, to actually change the music? Can you actually think fast enough to change pedal settings to get around these problems?
Not a chance. Not a chance. I could never do that. I mean, I expect something to do, but I certainly couldn't.
Right.
No,
Can I ask a quick harp question? I've been wondering for a while, just how much physical effort does it take to pluck a string? Because your instrument's rather like mine, except without the resonating box around it, and you've got to carry over an entire orchestra. How much sort of physical effort does it take to do that?
Well, it's not that. I mean, this is a difficult question to answer. I mean, it's not a huge amount of physical effort, but what is obviously, the harder you pull the string, the more likely you are to get blisters, and the harder you pull the string, the more likely you are to make a bigger noise. So to be able, I used to actually, in fact, one of the things that people used to say is that I used to play loudly. I play loudly, and so that the harp gets heard. I think it's very easy to have a sort of rather soft and timid approach. But part of that is driven by the fact that the harder you pull, the more likely you are to pull the skin away from the underlying structures and cause a blister. So that's why these things are good. This tape, because you have to use the right sort of tape, but it means that you can pull a lot harder. But I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that pulling the strings is particularly hard work.
Right. And just on a separate note, it was great to hear about the Ravel, because those two pieces were very important to me as well.
Oh, really?
When I was learning, yeah. And they were also very tricky pieces that I struggled with for a long time.
What was the other piece you were talking about?
Well, both Ravel pieces, the Introduction Allegro and the Rhapsody. I played them with an extremely talented piano duo partner.
Right.
Who's now studying computer science at Cambridge, so can still do everything. And so it was a big job for me to learn.
So were you conducting Ravel? Were you conducting the Introduction and Allegro, or?
No, it was they were both in piano duo format.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
It works really well. Yeah. But great.
I think you originally wrote it more with a sort of small string orchestra in mind, rather than just string quartet. So the different editions are slightly expressed slightly differently. But yeah, no, I haven't heard the piano duet version. That would be very tricky. Goodness me.
It works really well though. It sounds very exciting when it's going. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely good piece.
Can I just ask a slightly boring question? The Pleyel versus Erard question.
Yeah.
What was the effect of that on harp playing and harp sales and harp making? And did the Erard win?
Absolutely, yeah. No, the Erard won out completely, and very few people would try and play a cross-strung harp. It's called a double.
Well, it's used in the Baroque period, but I didn't know it was still a feature.
Yeah, it's used in that, but obviously the facility to change accidentals with your feet. It's like it's like being an organist. You've suddenly got a whole extra set of things that you can do simply because you're not just using your hands. So it completely opened it up, and that's why people like Erard were fascinated to try and explore the possibilities, and then Britain. So yes, Erard won. In fact, I did play an Erard harp when I started. You can't pull them with the same force. So with this machine, this neck here has essentially is laminated wood that's been compressed very, very hard. So it's a bit like a piece of concrete almost. It's very, very tough. And that technology simply wasn't available to Erard. And this is the weak part of the harp. And that would be where it would break on the Erards. With all the tension in these two things.
I thought you'd like to hear that story. So that would be next week. Rupert, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Nice to talk. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.